And then, so yeah, I'll start with like a quick 15, hopefully minute PowerPoint presentation to just kind of cover some of the important topics to consider. And then I'd like to just dive straight into it, open up some programs and have you guys watch along as I click around and do things and highlight the kind of features that have been kind of most useful during my scientific career that you guys might be able to get the most benefit out of. So I guess what I'll do is start by, I'm not sure if we've got everyone on yet, so I'll start by sharing my screen and kind of introducing myself.
So now everyone is in. As if there's more people that join, I'll just let them in as they pop up. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Okay. Here we go. All right. Can everyone see my introductory slide okay? So hi and welcome everyone to this educational coffee hour. This is something that we're trying to do as part of the ARO education committee to provide just educational resources in your everyday programming. So this coffee hour is called Visualizing Science, a crash course in digital graphics. Big caveat, I am not a graphic designer. I am just a scientist who has historically had interests in photography, art, and computers, and they've all aligned quite well with respect to creating digital graphics. So let's just jump straight in. Okay. We live in a world full of data and in a world full of data representations. I think we increasingly are at the stage where we're kind of hammered with all different visualizations and representations of all different things in the world. And this is fantastic. It means that we have a grounds on which we can kind of build our own figures to be able to communicate our science. And so one of the things to think about when trying to communicate data through figures is, what is data really? And so I think many people possibly have seen this illustration that kind of takes us from this idea of data being a thing and then moving through different kind of different metrics to get us to wisdom. So data, we add meaning to get information. Maybe we add some more experience to gain knowledge. Perhaps we have better understanding with that experience that brings us to insight. And ultimately, when we apply that insight to things, we have wisdom. This is the way to kind of think about this from numbers to meaning kind of idea. And what we want to do is to get ourselves as scientists out of this space where we think about presenting our data as, here is the data I collected. And we want to move more into the space where we can say, here is my addition to our field. So being really kind of mindful of what it is we're trying to communicate rather than just staying in our heads about our own data. What I often find, and I do this myself, is that like I spend so much time doing the experiments and collecting the data that by the time it's ready to be presented, sometimes it's just like, oh, let me just throw it in a graph and send it away. But there are ways that we can make all of that work stand out and better communicate exactly what it is we're saying to our readers. So in thinking about data and figures and graphics, I immediately started to ask myself, what makes a good figure? And so I'm on Reddit a fair bit, probably more than I should be, but two of the subreddits that I follow are data is beautiful and data is ugly. And I just want to say here, the data I'm going to show, I don't think that the underlying data are beautiful or ugly. It's how the data have been presented. So here's an example I took from the Data is Beautiful subreddit. It is showing us about global biodiversity. It has, it's telling us that it's declined nearly 70% since 1970. We have this really easy to read key that tells us, what we're looking for in the panels below. And then they've summarized here on the top panel, global biodiversity. So this matches what they've said here, 69% matches what it said here, declined since 1970 to 2018. Got 1970 on the left, 2018 here on the right. We can see the color scale kind of follows this, matches what they've said here. They've then broken it up into different regions. They've used the same color scale. They haven't duplicated these numbers because I don't think it's really necessary, even for someone who isn't kind of cognizant of biodiversity statistics in the last 50 years. It's not like you look at this and go, oh, there's so much I don't understand in this graph. It basically makes the point it's trying to make. On the other hand, we have this figure, which I'm still kind of like, I have stared at this figure for a long time, and I'm still kind of confused about what the authors were trying to tell us here. The question they've posed, which is the strongest Olympic team of all time? Strongest? What sport in particular? What do they mean by this strongest? We look down, oh, okay, this is the share of Olympic medals won. Got it. This is in percentage, all right. All right. Then we know that the host nations are in black, but they haven't actually identified each of the host nations. They've just, from a first view, it looks like they've just kind of randomly selected some boxes here. There are other things about this graph that I don't particularly like. So they've started with 4 numerals for the year, and then they drop down to 2 and they go back up to 4. Kind of understand why they did this, because obviously the Olympics takes place every 4 years, but it's not intuitive, And so what we need to kind of think about when we're making figures is, are we actually communicating what we want to the reader? And so I think these figures just kind of highlight that there are ways to do it in a simple manner and ways to do it that can kind of make things more complicated for everyone involved. So in putting together this presentation, I actually found this really fantastic paper called 10 Simple Rules for Better Figures, and they identify 10 kind of rules that I honestly believe that if you follow these, you will make better figures rather. So I'm not going to go into this in all that much detail because it is a published paper that you can access, and I've got the link there. So we're not going to worry too much about all of these points 1 to 9. Instead, what we're going to focus on is point 10, which is get the right tool. And so in their paper, they talk about using the right tools to be able to produce better figures. And they do discuss some of the analysis tools, so things like MATLAB, and how you can do that in non-graphic design tools. But what I'm going to focus on today is the software that we typically use to create our figures and posters, rather than things like gathering the data per se. So here I'm going to highlight, let's go straight into the tools. I wanted to highlight paid and free software. So I think we're all really familiar with Adobe Creative Cloud, or as it used to be called, the Creative Suite. I've got it as paid, but I do want to point out that at $55 a month for an individual pen, it's borderline extortionate. And so that was one of the reasons why I really wanted to do this coffee hour and just kind of remind everyone that there are free versions of it. Like, despite the fact that the Adobe software is by and large the best software to do this, there are free versions that are available that can allow you to do almost the same thing. And so I really want to make a point that even for those of us who do have access to Creative Cloud, that's awesome. And we have, these fantastic toolkits at our disposal. But for those of us who don't, I don't think this should be viewed as something that stops you from being able to create beautiful figures, because the other software does exist. So within the Creative Cloud, most of us are probably quite familiar with two particular programs. Photoshop, which deals with raster or bitmap graphics. So raster or bitmap graphics deal in pixels. The smallest unit is a small square, and then each of those squares will have different colors to make up an image. The other program we're probably quite familiar with is Illustrator, and this deals in vector graphics. Unlike raster or bitmap graphics that use pixels, vector graphics use paths. So typically you would use Photoshop for things like photos or micrographs or yeah, I guess all sorts of micrographs, so like a confocal image stack, max projection that's been flattened, for example. And then for Illustrator, you would use that for things like graphs, plots, schematics, even things like electrophysiology traces, for example, because those are all continuous paths. In terms of free software, I'm going to highlight 3 different examples, and I want you to all notice that I'm going to use this color coding for the rest of the presentation. Anything that deals with raster graphics, I'm going to kind of highlight in this blue color, and anything that deals with vector graphics, I'm going to highlight in this yellow color. So with respect to our free software, we have 4, and this distinction used to be the distinction between which software you use for raster or vector used to be a lot more important. I think these days most programs can handle a little bit of both. So Inkscape is going to be your free analog to Illustrator, and GIMP is going to be your kind of free analog to Photoshop. There's also this really great program or tool called photopea. And this one is actually browser-based. So I highly recommend this one for a number of reasons, but there are also a few drawbacks. I highly recommend it because it basically emulates Photoshop. The look and feel is really similar, and because it's browser-based, you don't have to download anything onto your computer. So this is a great option for if you have restrictions on what kind of software you're allowed to download to your work PC. This is a really good option. The downsides are because it is all online and web-based, if, for example, you're using an input device to draw, what I've found is sometimes if you have a metered internet connection, you can get bits dropping, and so you won't be able to get as smooth a line as if you are using an application. I don't think this is a big deal, and you can kind of work around it. So today, I think I'm going to go through probably some Photoshop, some photopea, some Illustrator, and some Inkscape if we have time. So let's focus a little bit more on the difference between raster and vector graphics. So as I said, raster use pixels and are typically used for photographs and micrographs. Vector typically use paths and are used for plots, graphs, flowcharts, schematics, that kind of thing. The major thing to remember is that raster graphics are not scalable. The quality of your image is dependent on your resolution and size. On the other hand, vector graphics are scalable. So this is one of the reasons why doing things like flowcharts or schematics in vector makes so much more sense, because if you want to blow your schematic up for a poster, you can do that without losing quality. Here's another example of the difference between raster and vector graphics. This is using the United States Coast Guard emblem, and we can see here in the raster, on the raster side, we've got these individual pixels that make up the line. So I want you to pay special attention to the curve here and notice how choppy it is, because remember, our individual units are single squares. So in order to make up a line, we just have to align the squares in the right color to make it look like a line when you're far enough zoomed out. I also want you to notice that at this magnification, at this zoom, this red line looks like a solid red line. But when we zoom in enough that we can see the pixels, you can see that there's actually gradients of red that go into making up this line. If we look now to the vector side, we can see a really different situation where the red is a nice crisp line and the entire thing is red. We can also see the crispness of this blue line. And we can also make out some things that I think they kind of prevent people from using Illustrator when you click on an object and you see all these extra things come up. I'm going to walk you through what they are so that they don't seem as scary. So what we've got here is they've just kind of called it anchor points, but what they're really referring to is something called a Bezier curve. And a Bezier curve is what you can use to create a path. And so what these curves allow you to do is place an anchor point that has a handle. And so using the correct type of mouse, the correct type of selection tool, after you've drawn your curve, you can click on a curve handle and raise it and move it around to change the features of the curve. And this is how you draw using vector graphics typically. So I've listed here a couple of common file types that you use for raster or vector graphics. I also wanted to go into just really quickly the types of considerations you need to keep in mind when thinking about file types. So I've got these 3 questions, which I think are kind of the basic questions that you want to ask yourself. Compression, am I willing to trade quality of resolution for file size? Second is readability, what programs can access the file? And editability, which kind of falls into the same category, do I need to retain editable features? So typically what I do when I'm creating figures is I will have my large file that has all of the information in it. And that's the one that I'll go to edit and make look better. And then when I'm ready to put it into a presentation or a poster or as a paper figure, what I typically will do then is I will flatten it so that I get a smaller file size. And obviously I'll retain both so that I can put the flattened version in things that I don't want other people to touch, and I can save the layered version for myself. So with respect to compression, typically it's broken up into 2. There is lossless compression, which means that you retain all of the features in the original file. Lossless compression typically will get you larger file sizes. There's then lossy compression. What this does is it will use, depending on what algorithm it uses, it will compress the file so that you get a smaller size. And the cost of that is the resolution. So you probably have noticed lossy compression when you've done something like take a beautiful landscape photo on your modern smartphone camera, and then you upload it to social media. And then someone says, oh, I really love that picture you took. Can you send it to me? And you're like, I don't know where the original is. So you download it back off social media, and you'll notice that it doesn't look anywhere near as nice as what you originally took. The reason why is social media is compressing that file so that it can host multiple of them there. Next thing, readability. You're going to have a toss up between proprietary file types and those that can be read by any program. So what I've got here under proprietary is your Photoshop document, PSD file, your Adobe Illustrator file, maybe a MATLAB file. You can say figures in MATLAB using the .mat extension. The ND2 is a Nikon Elements file. So these 2 are kind of proprietary, and well, I guess they're all proprietary. Yeah, and then readability for other file types. So basic file types, PNG, JPEG, TIFF, bitmap, PDF. These are all readable on many programs. And then you've got these ones here, which are your vectors as well. And so the reason why I've got these on many programs, for example, MATLAB can output EMF, EPSP files, etc. So final thing is editability. And so this is what I was talking about earlier with respect to, I typically will save a compressed version, which has been flattened as a smaller file that can be uploaded or inserted into other documents. And I'll also save an uncompressed version with the layers intact. So I've used this word layers a few times, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with them, but when I talk to people about this topic generally and speak about layers, I think a lot of people do express that they are scary and they don't know how to handle them. So that's one of the main things I'm going to focus on. So working with layers, here we've got a somewhat fast but great GIF of Bob Ross demonstrating how artists used to work with layers in analog paint media. So what is he doing here? He's starting by layering the background and the foreground, right? The clouds go up the top and you can see some of that lake being put on the bottom of the canvas. And then you can see he starts to apply layers of paint to build the scenery. That's basically the same thing that happens in graphic art. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to use an example of a collaboration between Paul Duard and Victor Vergara. It's called Elemental Masks, and this is a blog post which basically demonstrates how the artist was able to build such a beautiful and complex image on Illustrator. So they start with a drawing in Photoshop. And so that's the transparent background here. You can see how that background is rasterized, meaning we can see the pixelation points on, for example, down here. And then you can see on top of that, they've traced in Illustrator using paths. And you can really quickly identify the smoothness of the path versus the kind of hard edges of the rasterized version. From this, he can add some color and then eventually make the illustration look like this, where we have lots of different overlapping colors and lines. We can see different greens, we can see some blues down here. And so this is a way to just kind of demonstrate that Bob Ross idea of layering paint is identical to what we do in a graphical software. All right, so I put this here as a bit of a reminder for myself as to what I want to talk about when we move on to the programs. We'll talk about the workspace, panes and toolbars, a couple of things that might be important. This thing on the right, I just found online. It's a quick reference cheat sheet for Adobe Illustrator. It basically has the icons of each of your tools, what the tool is, and your shortcuts on the right. I think if you are trying to upskill in Illustrator or Photoshop, finding something like this, printing it out and putting it on, like pinning it to your wall is a really good way to start. Because I think that for a lot of people, the thing that stops them from going further is, I don't know what to do. And realistically, you can always hit Control-Z and undo whatever it is you did do. So having a play around, I think, is the best way to start. With that in mind, let's have a play around. So first thing I'm going to do, I think I'm going to, because we're running a little bit over what I was intending, let's start by looking at Photoshop. So let me bring Photoshop over. So I am using a Creative Cloud version, but for those of you who might be using Creative Suite, the non-online version, an older version of Photoshop, things will largely be the same. The tools haven't changed all that much. There are a few things that have changed, but I don't think it's enough to worry about. So in Photoshop, typically when I start with a document, I will be bringing in an image that was taken elsewhere. But for today's purposes, I'm just going to open a new file. So I'm going to come here and do new file. One of the things I highly recommend, particularly in Illustrator, but when you're putting together a figure, I recommend starting with your canvas size, the same size that you intend to print it. So always use letter. If you're in the US, use letter. If you're external, use A4. But what this does is it means that you will be able to make your artwork reasonable with respect to your page. So often in the past, when I haven't done this, I've made a beautiful figure and then realized that it was too big. And then in shrinking it, I'm going to deal with problems that you get because you're dealing with pixels. And if you're trying to fit more pixels in a smaller space, some of them have to go away. So I highly recommend setting your canvas up as if that is like your final document. So I typically do letter. your resolution is very important. 300 pixels per inch is kind of the minimum you want to be at to have nicely reproducible images for both print and screen. You'll notice here, you can actually choose pixels that are not square. I don't ever recommend doing that, but there are a bunch of features that you can change here that are different from the presets, for example, the color of the background, etc. So we're just going to use red, green, blue color, 8-bit. When I do create, hello, we have our window. So the first thing I want to tell you about, let me just move this over to this side so I have my reference here. Okay, so the first thing I want to tell you about is workspaces. A workspace is basically just how you set up your program. And you can think about this in terms of like an art studio for someone who is primarily a painter looks really different from an art studio for someone who's primarily uses coloring pencils or something, or like someone who does primarily like photography. And so the first thing that I like to do is come in here and make sure that my workspace is set to something that's logical. So just to show you guys what it looks like, if I change this, for example, to photography, we'll see that the different window panes that are available have changed. The toolbar stays the same. Everything here on the left on the toolbar is the same, but what it's done is it's given me this video timeline pane down the bottom here. And then what have we got here? We've got the addition of, so here we've got this clone source pane that I'm not going to use. I don't know what that is at the moment. So let's go back to our essentials, which is actually the default view. And so now you can see our workspace has basically the basics for what you want to use. If you ever come in to Photoshop or Illustrator and it looks completely different to what you're used to, this is the first thing you're going to want to do. Window, workspace, reset to essentials. If it's already on essentials and it looks really wrong, you can just hit reset essentials and it'll kind of reinitialize how your workspace should look. So there are a couple of other things I want to point out here. One of the big ones is this ruler. The ruler is super useful for doing a bunch of things. Remember I said that I like to have my canvas set to the same size as my paper? The ruler means that if I know I have 3 panels that I want to do, I can use the ruler to precisely set up where I want everything. And so one of the ways you can do this is using something called guides. So if you click and drag from either the horizontal or vertical ruler, you will get a line, right? And that line is a guide that you can snap other things to. So you can imagine a situation where you have a 3-panel plot and you want them to be beautifully precise. You can set up your guides and then just snap your images exactly where you need them to be. And you can put your panel legend, your panel figures A, B, C, etc. here. So that's guides. You can also just click on them and delete them. And what you'll notice here on the right in the history pane, everything I do gets logged in my history so that if I want to go back to a state in time, I can just click that and we will go back. This is kind of like an advanced tool because what you can do is you can change the number of points in history that are actually saved, depending on how big your files are and how you like to work with things. But this is something that's pretty useful. So layers. We spoke about layers a bit. Our layers pane is down here in the bottom. And what you'll notice is that we have this background layer. You'll notice there's a lock here on the right and a little eyeball here on the left. This lock means that we're not going to be able to do anything to this layer. So I can select the paintbrush tool. And what you notice is I have just drawn on the background layer. This is something I do not recommend doing. What I do recommend doing is double clicking the background layer and you'll get this dialog box, this new layer dialog box. And what it does is it converts this background layer into just a regular layer. I'm going to hit OK. And what you notice is that lock is now gone and we can toggle the visibility on and off. If we want to lock this layer, we still can do it. We just go here and click the lock button. And then what you'll notice is I am not able to do anything to this layer. Getting used to locking layers is a fantastic way to make sure you do not accidentally move or draw on something that you do not want to move or draw on. So the way that I like to work with things is I typically make a new layer. So remember before when we were looking at Bob Ross, everything he did on top of the old layer would obscure the things behind it. And that's true for Photoshop and Illustrator as well. So if I wanted to make a new layer, I'll come down here and click the new layer button. And I want you to all notice as well, every time I hover over something, you'll notice a little tooltip comes up. This is one of the ways that I learned how to do things. I would hover over things, then I would see what tooltip came up, and then I would Google it and be like, is that related to anything I maybe want to do? Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. But that's a good way to just kind of be aware of the fact that you're not alone in this. The program will try and help you out where it can. All right, so I'm going to make a new layer, and then I'm going to draw something. So I had spoken a little bit about the difference between raster and vector graphics. So what I'm going to do here in Photoshop is I am going to use my pen tool. Oh, not my pen tool, sorry, my brush tool here. Actually, before I go into all of that, I think I should tell you guys a little bit more about the toolbar here. So these are all your different tools. You can like I said, you can hover over each of these to kind of, it's unfortunate that it's hovering on the left-hand side of the screen, not the right, but you can hover over them to know what they are. You can also notice that some of these tools have this little triangle in the bottom right corner. That basically means if you right-click on that, you're going to have two options within that tool, right? So we've got the move tool and the upward tool. Here, this is the marquee tool. If I right click, we've got different types of marquees that I can make. There's a lasso tool. If I right click, we've got different options, etc., etc. So the tools you're going to be using most are probably going to be the move tool, the marquee tool, or maybe the lasso tool, depends on what you're working with, and things like the brush. So here I have selected the brush, and if I wanted, let's say I wanted to draw an arrow, I could do that using the brush like this, and we can see that it's quite messy. We can also see a few things. If I zoom in all the way, keep zooming, you can see that even though the arrow looked fine zoomed out, when we zoom in, because we're working with pixels here, we don't get nice, beautiful, crisp edges. And instead, we are able to see the rasterization that is set by the resolution. So this is non-ideal. And I would stick to doing photo manipulations in Photoshop and doing things like annotations and arrows in Illustrator. So I guess there were a few other things I wanted to tell you about Photoshop, but I might just, I might kind of stop there and move to, I might show you really quickly what photopea looks like and then do the majority of the rest of the training in Illustrator. So that was Photoshop. If I bring up photopea, whoops. So this is what it looks like. You can just, you can go to the website or you can just Google it. And it's usually the first thing that comes up. When you click on it, it looks like this. You'll see the feel is really similar to Photoshop. You can see down here, it does a bunch of different file types, and similar to how I had things kind of arranged, you've got your proprietary file types, and then you've got your kind of any is good. So same deal, we can open a new project. Looks pretty similar. So we want to do a print, we want to do letter, we want to make sure we've got 300 DPI, so pixels per inch. Our background is white again. And then I can do create. So remember, this is browser-based, but the look and feel are pretty similar to Photoshop. We even have the background here. If I double click on this, we get layer style. That's great. I can put a new layer down, and then I can do the same thing. So I can come and find my brush. That's just for consistency's sake, make this 20 as well. And then I can do the same thing, make a really ugly arrow, zoom in, and you can see it's rasterized. So this is one of the reasons why I've said that I think Photoshop and photopea are really good and easy to use together. I think that there are a bunch of different ways to think about when you should be using each, but I think just play around with it. That's one of the easiest things to do. You can always click on things and undo. So for now, because we've got 20 minutes left, I'm going to switch to Illustrator because I think this is going to be a little bit more useful for the majority of people. So here is what Illustrator looks like when you open it up. Same deal as Photoshop. When I create a new document, I'm going to do create new and then do a letter. And what you notice here as well is, so in my recent items, you'll see I have 2 letters, and this doesn't really make sense until you look at this. So this one I'm working in points, which is the same as like your font point size. And in this one, I'm working in inches. So if you are like me, from a place that uses metric, it's super easy to just switch this down to millimeters. You can work with whatever makes the most sense to you. If you want a landscape document versus a portrait, this is where you do that. And when you can see when you select the other orientation, the width and the height invert. See that? So let's just do a letter. Okay, good. Preview. Okay, so we create, and we have our artboard. So again, we can do workspace. We can see I'm set to Essentials Classic. If I was, let's say I was trying something else, it changes the layout a bit, but I can come back here and do Workspace, Essentials Classic. Nice. So this is very similar to Photoshop, but there are a few things to consider. In Photoshop, so you'll notice that the toolbar is quite different and there appear to be more tools. You'll notice that there isn't a color selection pane the same way as there was in Photoshop. There it is now. There we go. So you can expand all of your work panes by clicking this double arrow. You can close them, you can minimize them. You can come to window and select new panes as well. These are all things that aren't necessarily open when you open the program. So let's open these guys up. Let me just reset Essentials, because there was more than I was expecting there. Okay, and similar to Photoshop, when we look down here, we've got our layers. So the way that layers work in Illustrator are slightly different to the way that layers work in Photoshop. And so to demonstrate this, what I'm going to do is start putting down a few different shapes. So if I come over here to the left on my toolbar, I'm going to select the rectangle tool and draw a rectangle. If I hold Shift, then I will draw a square because it keeps the aspect ratio even. So I'm just going to draw a rectangle. And so I want you to notice a few things about this rectangle. The first is that it is a black line around the outside. So that's called your stroke. And then the fill is white, and that's called your fill. You can see these details in 3 places on the screen. Well, 4 if you include the actual shape. So the shape tells you what it is. Then you can see it down here in the toolbars. You can see it up here in the strokes toolbar, and you can also see it here in your swatches. If you want to change the coloring of this rectangle, either the fill or the stroke, you can do so in any of these 3 places. The thing to remember, or the thing to note is, do you notice how this white box is on top of the black box? That means that whatever color you choose is going to change the fill. If I select this box, you'll now notice that the stroke is on top of the fill. And this means whatever color I select is going to change the stroke. So here, I'm going to change the stroke to red. And then if I click on my select tool and deselect this box, we can see a little bit more clearly that it's now gone red. What I'd like to do next is I'm going to put a circle on top of this, just to show you the behavior of how things work. So again, if I don't hold shift, then I'm going to get an oval. If I do hold shift, then I'm going to get a circle. Okay, so I've put a circle down. I'm going to go back to my selection tool. And so what you'll notice here is because my stroke was set to red, here I have a red stroke and a white fill. So let's say I actually want to be able to see this rectangle underneath the circle. The way to do that is to remove the fill. So I want to select this object, select the fill, and then select none. Okay. And so now what I've done is put one layer on top of the other, but made it so that we could see both. When I come down here and I look at my layers, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pop this toolbar to the side so we can see them a little bit easier, or this pane to the side. So we can see that the ellipse is on top of the rectangle. If I swap these over, now this portion of the circle has gone missing because the rectangle is on top and the rectangle is filled with white. So this is just a basic kind of understanding of layers in Illustrator and how to kind of work with what is on top of or below the other. So relative positioning in the Z plane is basically what your layers are getting you. I'm going to make a new layer now. And what you'll notice is that, or what I'd like you to notice is a few things. So layer one here, you'll notice there are a few blue lines. What these blue lines are telling you are the color of the selection in that layer. So I mentioned this is the selection tool before. This is what's called the selection tool. And the thing that can be kind of confusing in Illustrator is that there is a selection tool and a direct selection tool. The selection tool will allow you to select an object, any object that is not locked. The direct selection tool will allow you to select a feature of the object. So when I click on this, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 corners. Great. If I click on this one, you can see this particular corner has now been highlighted blue while the others are not. With the direct selection tool, if you click on any particular anchor point, you can then move that single anchor point. This is true for any shape that has multiple anchor points. So earlier, I told you about Bezier curves and how we have an anchor point and a handle. So let's say I didn't actually want a circle. What I wanted was a teardrop, right? One way I might try doing that could be to, so all I did there was I clicked and I dragged. And I'm still clicking, and you can notice that as I click and drag, the curve starts to change. If I bring this closer in, then there's less of a curve. The more I bring it out, the more it pulls the curve out, right? So this is how you work. And so this is using the direct selection tool. If I go back to my regular selection tool, now I select the whole object and I can do object manipulation. So I can do scales, rotations, transforms, whatever I need to do, I can do using that. So I created this shape by using a circle and then editing one of the handles or anchor points. I can also create this shape simply by using the pen tool. The pen tool is unlike the brush tool that allows you to paint or the pencil tool that allows you to draw. The pen tool allows you to specifically specify where your anchor points are. And so I will typically use the pen tool when I am doing things like making curved arrows. So let's say I wanted to make a curved arrow to illustrate the top of this teardrop shape. So I've got my pen tool, I'm going to click, and that's going to put a line down. right? So that, oh, well, it's going to put my anchor point down, and then it's going to show me where my line is going to go. I want to create a curve over here. So I'm going to do 3 points to have a nice smooth curve. And what I'm going to do is click and drag. So I haven't actually placed the point yet, but it's allowing me to kind of get a feel for where this curve is going to go and where I want it to end up. So then probably going to drag here as well, because it's going to be weird if it's just a straight line. So I'm going to click and drag. And then you'll notice it isn't quite, it is, and then we keep going. So to finish your curve, you can either hit escape or you can double click on the final point. So I'm sure all of you are looking at this and going, well, that's an ugly line. Why has she done that? Well, the reason why is that we can actually fix this up. All we need to do is find the pencil tool. Where are you? There we go. So this is the shaper tool. And if you come down here to the smooth tool, all you have to do is make sure that your object is aligned, and then you just draw over it with the path that makes more sense. And it will put your curve, it will put your anchor points in for you. So I'm doing a pretty bad job of this right now because my mouse isn't the greatest. But this is one way that you can fix up a path that you have set down and you're like, oh, that doesn't look quite right. There are other things you can do as well. So if you use the anchor point tool, you can go in and change your anchor points. So remember, your direct selection tool allows you to select either the anchor points or handles. So I can zoom in a bit and show you. So here, using the direct selection tool, here, using the direct selection tool. If I use the direct selection tool here, because we don't actually have a handle, we only have the anchor point. You're like, oh, how do I get this so it's rounded? Well, you come here and you use your anchor point tool, and that allows you to create your handle. Okay. So this is all just basic working with paths in Illustrator. There are a couple of other things we can do that I'm going to try and get to nice and quickly. So I showed you how to draw a line, which means that you can draw a curved arrow if you prefer. And if you have a nice steady hand, you can use this, which is the continuous draw tool. So you don't have to set your handles, and it will make a nice curve for you. But for now, what I'm going to do is show you how to put arrowheads and things on. So I was working with one of my, so let's do, oh, before I do that, I want to do one thing. And I made a point of showing you that this color had moved, right? So what I'm going to do is move this path into layer 2. And what I want you to notice is that the blue anchor points now will turn to red. This isn't great because our line is actually red. So I can change the color here by double clicking on this. See how it says color? I can put this to something that has a bit more contrast. I'm not going to use green in case anyone has color blindness, and instead I'll use cyan. So what you can see there is the difference between, if I go back to my regular selection tool, when I select this object that's in layer 1, which is color-coded blue, the outline is blue. When I select this object, which is in layer 2, the outline is now in cyan. So this is one of the ways that working with layers becomes a little less scary when you have a lot of layers going on, because what you can do is you can group all of your different elements into layers and give them their own colors. So in this particular instance, what I'm going to do is change the color of this line to let's do green. No, let's do purple. Whoa, see what I did there? Did not check which was selected. So we can do this, so we can do purple, we'll click away, and we've got a purple line. So there are a few fun things that you can do here as well. So now in layer 2, I've got a purple line, and I'm going to move our little raindrop there as well. So often you'll find that there are a bunch of different paths with different appearances on them. And one of the things that I have found most useful with Illustrator in my scientific career is this. So I know that this teardrop has a particular fill color, a particular stroke color. It has no fill, and it has a particular stroke weight. So stroke weight refers to how thick the line is. We can make this line thicker by increasing the stroke weight. We can make the line dotted by selecting this stroke and then selecting dashed line, right? We can change the periods of the dash and the gap by putting in different numbers here. And we can make it so that the gaps are bigger than the dashes by changing the gap number. All of this is super easy to do. And what I'll just draw your attention to again is that I came up here and clicked on the stroke to do this, but you can also see down here, there is a stroke panel, which allows you to do the exact same thing. You just have to, come on, man. So you can change it in this appearance as well. And so this appearance can be kind of useful to tell you what, if you are clicking on one of these to identify your object, you can come down here and see the features of that object. But what I wanted to show you is something called select same. So what I have here is my teardrop. It has red stroke. If I come up here and say select same appearance, you'll notice that there are a bunch of different things. So let's say I want to select every object in my artboard that has red stroke. I'll come here and I'll do select same stroke color. What you'll notice is, so basically on the right here, this circle and this colored box will tell you which of the objects in your artboard are currently selected. So we have our rectangle path selected and we have our teardrop path selected because both of them have the property or the attribute that is a red stroke. What else can we do? So here we have a purple stroke at 1 point in wideness, and here we have a red stroke at 1 point in wideness. So we can do the same, select same stroke weight, and then it selects these two objects. So kind of knowing what kind of objects you have in your artboard will help you really quickly make selections and edit them, right? So because we asked it to select the same, so now we can see that even though they have the same stroke weight, they have different fills and different color. And because both of them are highlighted, we have question marks here. So if we really quickly wanted to say, highlight everything with the same stroke and turn that stroke black, all we need to do is come here and select black. And then both of those objects are now black. So this is really useful when you're exporting from other programs where you end up with weird weights or weird strokes, or so I've found in the past exporting from Prism, sometimes I'll bring it in and then all of my lines will go to like 1.86 point. And I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so that really irritates me. So this has been a nice, easy way for me to go in and change everything. I feel like I've been talking for ages and I haven't gotten anything I haven't gotten everything I wanted to say across, but let's just do a few more example things. So I did the line, I did this. So other things you can do to kind of simplify working with paths or working with multiple layers is, again, being really mindful of which layer is visible at any given time, and also using the lock feature. So what I just did here is I locked this layer, and you'll notice, unlike Photoshop, you can actually view a locked layer, right? But you can't move it. You can't do anything to it, but it will still be there. There are other features of layers that are super useful. I've done a bunch of arrowheads. Okay, text boxes. Let's quickly talk about text boxes because I think this is one of the things that gets on a lot of people's nerves. When you select the text tool and you click, you end up with this, which is the type tool. Oops, that's look. Here's your type tool. There is another way that you can use the type tool, and that is by clicking and dragging to make a box. This is called the area type tool. So let's do this. The way that these two types of text are different relate to scalability. So because this is a box that you're placing your words in, you can change the size of the box and nothing will happen to the words. Because this is an area, because this is a type tool, when you try and change the size of this box, you will see the text will change as well. You can very simply convert from these two different types of tools by just double clicking here. I think this is one of the things that a lot of people get really, really frustrated by, because you'll put your thing down and go, okay, I want to then move this. Oh no, I need it to be this. And it doesn't behave how you want it to. So all you got to do again is see this little circle on the side there. You just double click that. Pretty easy, right? Other things to consider. So it was just telling me that text was a lot bigger than it was expecting because I didn't use the font size to change how big it was. So other things to consider. When you have a text type tool like this, the object is viewed as differently from when it's just a text object. So for this, I can change the fill and the stroke. Oh, I should choose something that makes a bit more sense. I can change the fill and the stroke, and I can do the same for this. Fill, whoop, that's stroke. So we want fill and stroke. So that's like the invert, I guess, of what I did there. You can also change the background of your box. Whoops. Right, obviously we don't want that. We want something that's maybe a bit more contrasty. But here you can change the color of the box that the words exist in. You can't do that with your type tool, which is right here. So these are just things to consider. And remember, before we did select same, we can do the same with text. All right, select same stroke color. Do you notice that it does both the text object, but it also does our line object? So I think that's something that is super useful. And while I was doing this line, there was one thing I forgot to tell you all about. And I think that's possibly one of the most important things for us as scientists. Where do you find the arrowheads? They come under this stroke toolbar. So if you come here just under where I did the dashed line, you'll see this arrowhead section. And there are a bunch of built-in arrowheads that you can use and that you can choose from. And these include things that you might use for like neuronal diagrams or circuit diagrams. So like inhibition, excitation, that kind of thing, as well as your kind of your everyday arrows. So what you'll notice here is as soon as I clicked the arrowhead, it put an arrowhead here. Maybe it put it on the wrong side. It's super easy to fix. You just press this button here and that'll swap the end. So that's arrowheads. We're kind of out of time now. So I think I should just really, really quickly. So I didn't get a chance to show you Inkscape, but I think that's all right because a lot of the feel of it is really similar to Illustrator. And there are a lot of resources available online that will, so that brings us to this slide. Yeah, so there are a lot of resources available online. I've put a few references here. The biggest one is Google. You know, I mentioned it before, but often when I'm struggling with something, I will Google in the most layman's terms I can think of. And typically there will be a graphic designer who has asked the exact same question. And so typically you get a result. So for example, with the text tool, when I was struggling with that, what did I put in? I put in like Adobe Illustrator text tool, box instead of object, or something very vague like that. And that was enough to get me to the right place. I've got a few other useful references and resources here. This one I mentioned before, the 10 simple rules for better figures. I highly recommend everyone have a read through that. I found this while I was kind of poking around. This is the Raj Laboratory Basic Adobe Illustrator Guide. It is a PDF document or a Google Doc that is the most comprehensive guide to Adobe Illustrator I have ever seen. And I really think that the author Jiang does a fantastic job of making the reader aware of a bunch of the tools that I was talking about, and kind of style guidelines for how the PI in this lab in particular likes to have his figures created. Another one I want to draw your attention to is this Image Integrity and Standards that was published by Nature Portfolio. I think this is, it's good for people to understand kind of what is and isn't, like understanding the basic between raster and vector graphics is one thing, but then understanding what you can and cannot do to raster graphics, like what is scientifically acceptable, is a very big deal. So in Photoshop, I think a lot of people are scared by the fact that you can kind of touch up certain areas, but there are many tools that do not allow you, or rather that allow you to change the appearance of things without physically changing the underlying data. And so you can use things called adjustment layers. And what they do is, instead of changing, so for example, if you had like a micrograph and you had a histogram, your LUT histogram, and there are a bunch of values that are not encoded, then you can push the levels to a more reasonable place. And in this article, they discuss that doing that is okay if you do it across the entire image and you state that you're doing that. And so I think that some of the fears that we as scientists have about working with this software relates to the fact that we don't know exactly what we're doing, but there are resources that you can refer to ensure that you do. And the last one I've got here is Colbus, which is a colorblindness simulator. I didn't actually show you this, so I might just quickly, since we're still here, you can do this in Illustrator and Photoshop, where you can go View, Proof Setup, and then check for color blindness. So you're either going to click on the protanopia type, and that's going to show you what it's like if you have that style of color blindness, or you can click the deuteranopia type, and that's going to show you the other as well. So these are all things that allow you to ensure that your that what you produce is as accessible as possible. And so for those of you who have stayed past, I'm sorry for going over, I want to do one thing and show you an example of how I use my knowledge of this graphic design software to create figures that I have had for my entire scientific career. So this is an example that if you've ever seen me give a talk, you've probably seen this figure. This is my mouse auditory pathway figure. So I have it broken up into the background and the different pathways. So I can just simply, because everything is grouped into layers, I can remove all of my pathways and instead just have the brain available. And then if I'm talking about tonotopy and the ascending pathway, I might click this one on. If I'm talking about the descending pathway, I might click this one on. And so what I have is basically a resource that's set up that I've spent many hours over the years putting time back into this, but realistically it was kind of simple. And every time I show this figure, all I need to do is update what aspects I want the reader to see. So I don't think I really got to talk about everything I was intending on, but I think you can only do so much in an hour. But I hope this has been super instructive for everyone who's still here. And I just wanted to leave you with this really funny figure from XKCD. So this is showing a single data point, and it says science power move. When one of your data points is really cool, devote a whole figure to it. And I hope that we don't do this, but yeah, that's all I've really got. So thanks for hanging around. And I hope it was.
Sorry, I was just going to tell you there were a couple of questions if you have a few minutes to address those.
Sure, I can give them a shot. Let's
There's
see.
one from George. When it comes to visualizing data, like using a bar or line graph, is that decision made before you move to Adobe or free software? I'm sorry, my Teams is going off. Or is there a way to toggle between different graph templates within the software?
So yeah, so I didn't really talk about my workflow, but typically I don't use the graphic design. Thanks for your question, George, by the way. I don't usually use the graphic design software to create graphs because things like tick marks are kind of difficult to work with. And so typically what I'll do is my workflow, depending on the type of experiment I'm doing. So like for my ePhys experiments, I'll collect the data on my Hecker amplifier. I'll import that Hecker file to my computer. Then I open everything in MATLAB. I create a figure in MATLAB, which I then export as an EMF or EPS file. So both of those are vector graphic files. I'll then take that graphic into Illustrator, and then I'll use the tools in Illustrator like select same stroke or whatever to do that. So typically I don't do things like switch types of graphs within the software. And what I would recommend, if you're not sure which one you do, what I would do is recommend doing both and bringing them into Illustrator or Photoshop. Is that useful? Awesome.
And then we've got one more from Kathy. For your text box in Illustrator, can you put an outline stroke of the text box and not the actual letters?
Yep, sure can. So remember I made the distinction between just the type where you click and you start typing versus the one where you draw the box. And then I changed the box color to green. You do it the same way you do it for the text. So you just convert to your stroke tool or your stroke rather than your fill and choose whatever color you need. So that's the way to do that. Is there any other questions? Nope. Okay. Well, if there are any questions from the people in the room, please feel free to speak up. I'm happy to give you a couple more minutes. And I'm sorry that we didn't go into everything, but you know what? I bet I could do like an undergrad course teaching everyone how to use Illustrator and Photoshop. There's just so much in there. And I think that's one of the reasons why I did want to highlight this for everyone. That I think sometimes we, like I said earlier, sometimes we just get so tired by the time it comes to actually disseminating our data that we forget that, you know, it is data, but we want to turn it into something that people read and go, this is amazing. I'll be like, what are they trying to show here? And so I think that like with these tools at your disposal, you can, it's just a matter of kind of getting your hands dirty and figuring out what works for you.
We've got one more question.
Which do you? Okay. So typically what I do is I will, if I have it, so let's say I've got like a micrograph and then a plot that shows what I quantified on that. Typically what I'll do is I'll do some pre-processing in Photoshop. That's where I'll put in the scale bar and make sure that it looks kind of how I want it to and all of that kind of stuff. And then what I'll do is so I didn't actually talk about this, but there is another piece of software that Adobe has called InDesign. And that piece of software is typically what I like to use to create posters, because what it is a desktop publishing software. And so what you can do in InDesign is you can take images from Photoshop and line plots or schematics from Illustrator and have them together, and you can have them as linked files so that as you're working on your InDesign, if it crashes or if something goes wrong, nothing happens to your original files because they're stored elsewhere. Nowadays, because I don't think it's very, because of how expensive it is these days, I typically only have access to Photoshop and Illustrator. And my suggestion is that you do the finalized figure in Illustrator, because Photoshop will rasterize things like your panel labels. So like your A, B, C, any sort of arrowheads that you put in, depending on, like, because it's not scalable, you won't be able to do it as much. Granted, you're not going to be able to scale your raster image in Illustrator. You will be able to scale the other elements. So as long as you have a high enough DPI or resolution, when you drop it into your Illustrator document, you usually have a little bit of playroom with respect to what size you can make it before you do start to see rasterization errors. I hope that helped. Anshu?
For the recording, I'm just going to go ahead and read the question because they won't be able to see the chat. That was to answer which tool do you prefer if you have both photograph and line graph on the same figure. So,
yep. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's all of our questions. That was great.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming along.
Thank you. We will have the recording posted on AOR's website as well as the YouTube channel, and we'll make sure that we have access to all of the links for resources posted there as well.
Yep, sounds good. Thanks, everyone. Have a great Wednesday.